Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
It's always nice to have you all here, especially on a long weekend where we all could be maybe doing something more fun than being here, although I think it can be fun to be here as well. Welcome to all of you with us over the internet. It's always nice to have you back as well. Today our lecture, it's going to be Marco, and it's going to be talking about drugs and us, and which is, I think, a very important lecture, especially for the days that they're living today, where drugs is pretty much part of our daily lives these days. But before we start our lectures, as always, we're going to have Miguel doing our initial reading, and then we're going to have a prayer before it.
Today we'll be reading like the small reading by the Valdo Pereira Franco and Joanna Gentilis, and do all you can to keep your health. Many illnesses are caused by maladjusted temperaments, emotions out of alignment, or negative spiritual influences. Anxiety, fear, pessimism, anger, jealousy, and hatred are responsible for diseases yet to be cataloged and undermine physical, emotions, and mental health. Try to keep calm, cultivating good thoughts that will provide your inestimable benefits. As you are mentally, so will be your existence. Thank you.
So let us all now, together, join our hearts and our minds and connect with God, our Creator, with Jesus, our Master, and all the good benefactors here present. And let's ask them to help us to learn a little bit more today, to enlighten our minds, so we can get a little bit stronger in the divine laws that Jesus brought to us. We also want to ask to the good spirits here present to enlighten our brother Marco during this lecture, so he can help us to understand a little bit more of the effects of drugs in our lives, so we can make better decisions and help the others that are around us that also need this knowledge. And so be it.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
All right, so today we're going to talk about drugs. And I mean, we'll start everything by actually going through some of the misconceptions that we have on this topic. And then moving from that, we'll try to bring in context some of the effect that drugs can have, not only in our physical body, but also in our spiritual body and our spirit as a whole. And I think that's really the topic of the lecture today, is understanding the spiritual repercussions of using certain drugs. And then that's, a lot of what we're going to be talking about today. Okay, so the primary concept of what a drug is actually quite broad. So the general description of the term drug is any substance that's, when taken into someone's body or one's body, will have a physiological response or some type of response that will alter the normal function of your body. In that sense, almost anything we take can be put under that umbrella of drugs. For example, I think pretty much everyone here has been on drugs. Does anyone drink coffee? Yeah, you guys drink coffee? Coffee has an addictive substance on it. It's called caffeine. Caffeine is a stimulant. It works in your brain cells. It affects the behavior of you. Your body changes, your saliva gland changes, your sweat gland changes, your metabolism changes, your brain changes, you process information differently, you can be more active, your thoughts can change, you may not be as asleep, you can be more awake. This status of this rush status that caffeine can bring you is actually a definition of a drug. So caffeine is a drug. Where else do you think you guys can find caffeine, for example? Tea, Yeah. What else? Cola. That's soft drinks, right? Even kids' drinks. Sometimes they do have traces of caffeine, which is quite concerning, because as we know, taken at low doses, research has shown to us, and there's an enormous body of evidence showing that low dose use of caffeine has absolutely no detrimental effects on long term. There's lots of contrasting evidence. One paper will come and say, well, you know, if you drink a lot of caffeine, you may have that, or you may get better with this, or get worse with that. But overall, the data is very, it's very weak. So in general, the big studies that show the significant analysis fail to show any real significant changes to us. So it is a safe drug. We can use it in small amounts, right? But obviously, you guys are very well aware that taking it in larger amounts can be fatal. And we have several recent episodes, unfortunately, of young individuals who have taken some of the stimulatory drinks, right, and have actually discriminated because of a severe amount, like a significant amount of intoxication of caffeine in the body, right? So there's a drug, right? Another drug that's quite well consumed every day is like nicotine. Nicotine is very addictive and has an enormous amount of changes into your body, but that one is quite negative because it has another body of evidence that shows that it's actually not that good, right? It actually changes a lot of things in your body in a negative way, not only addictive, but also can promote cancers and things like this, right? So just to show you how we're surrounded by drugs, right? Now, some of them, these are licit drugs. In other words, this is something that you can go to a grocery store and buy, right, in general. And then you have illicit drugs. Those are the ones that are not accepted by our own laws. So we're not talking about divine laws. We're talking about our human laws, right? So human laws set up a little threshold where a drug is considered licit or illicit. For example, alcohol is a very well-known drug, which is licit. We can buy it and we can consume it. Can we die of alcohol? Oh, big time, yes. How many deaths are caused by alcohol on a daily basis? Countless, right? But it is considered illicit, and you know, there are some very significant detrimental effects. Now, the big question for us is that we know based on medicine that, you know, these drugs have an effect in our bodies, right? We can tell, we can check the enzymes in the liver, we can look at our brain function, we can look at several things and say, well, yeah, this is what's happening to you when you ingest this particular drug. But what happens to us as a spirit? That's where Spiritism comes in, right? And that's exactly what we're going to be talking about today. But continuing this, what I call big misconceptions about drugs. So for example, who takes, let's say, who ever took an anti-inflammatory medication ever in your life? Right? Pretty much all of us. Right, that is a drug, right, which is licit when prescribed by someone who has a capability of prescribing. It has very good effects on us, right? But also, when we abuse drugs, the same medication, if you abuse it, then it turns into something that can be very detrimental to you, right? So the idea that we talk about drugs and people have a misconception that we're talking about something bad is quite wrong, right? There are many drugs that actually allow us to be here today, and I'll give you one example. So one very good example is, you know, Fleming in 1929. He's a scientist and Nobel laureate, and he was trying to culture some particular types of bacteria in a petri dish. So we have a little petri dish, and we put colonies of bacteria. We wait them to grow and kind of measure how much they grow in a round circle from where you seed them. So it's a standard assay. It's been done for hundreds and hundreds of years. So he realized that certain cultures that he was trying to grow were not growing at all. So the bacteria is just not growing, right? No one knows exactly why, because remember at that time, the idea of having an antibiotic, it's something like of a dream. We didn't have it. I know, surprising. This is 1929, not too long ago. We had no medications to fight, efficiently fight bacterial infection. So he was able to isolate a strain of yeast from a penicillin, which now, when we purified that particular protein, was isolated, and we know exactly which is the protein that has that effect. We take it now for granted. So whoever took a penicillin-based drug here, an antibiotic, pretty much, unless you have a severe allergy to it, well, pretty much all of us, right? Amoxicillin, penicillin, and so on and so forth, right? Do you think we're going to be here today alive if penicillin was not around? There's very good chances that we're not, right? Because probably we don't remember this, but in the late 1800s, the number one cause of death was actually bacterial infections that went under control. And it was so common that people would just accept it. In other words, you have a severe lung infection, for example, it's like, sorry, you know, he's going to die or she's going to die. There's actually nothing to do. Because if your body was not able to cope with that bacterial infection, that was pretty much a definition of a discarnation. You just wait and it will go. So it was something common. So people used to die young, 50s and 40s, right? Because of this. And now we have this drug which saves lives every single day. And because of penicillin, we're able to change it so many different ways in the lab, and now we have at least 14 different types of it, right, that we can have available with different strengths, and then we understood how that worked, and now we have about 8 or 10 different classes of antibiotics, which unfortunately now we're running out of it. So there are some bacteria now that can actually survive in any different type of antibiotics that we have available, so that's quite scary, right? So we're going back to 1929, really. Okay, so we're talking about the idea of having some very good drugs and some very bad drugs. Some of them licit, some of them illicit. We talked about the idea of use versus abuse, right? I'll give you another example. When then morphine was first isolated, right? So you guys probably remember this, right? So it was the opium poppy. It was like a poppy, right? So it's isolated from the poppy. It's well known to have some physiological activity way before we had morphine isolated, right? So morphine, heroin, codeine, they're all the same type of alkylating agents that can fight pain, right? So they block the way your nerves sense the pain, right? So that's why you can cope with pain when you take those medications, okay? It helps a lot when you're in acute pain. There's no doubt about it, right? If someone is in acute pain that you cannot cope with and your last resort is to take it, you take it and pain goes away, right? But if you abuse it, it's as devastating as any illicit drug. For example, heroin is a good example of it, which is a cousin to morphine, and it's quite devastating. How many overdoses we're having in Canada every day because of this drug? Hundreds and hundreds, right? It's almost like an epidemic. It is a health concern for all of us, okay? So just to show you in perspective that it really depends on the context and what we're talking about. Like drugs, you know, they have, in general, when you say that word, it brings a kind of a negative ideas about it, right? And just not like that. Some other misconceptions, right? So let's talk about that. So a lot of people like to say, you know, and I'm in practice, so I know because I deal with that every day, right? So in my practice, sometimes people would say, well, I don't want to take meds. I want to go natural, okay? That's a common thing, right? And I respect that. The problem is, going natural doesn't mean you're going safe. There's a huge difference between going safe and going natural, right? And I'll give you an example. Some of the worst toxins ever created by humanity are derived from common things, right? Like mushrooms, you know, like ricin, for example, was extracted from, you know, from a seed, a nut, right? So it's extracted from it. Is the most powerful right now poison that we have available. Like 10 micrograms will kill an adult individual, right? It's natural. You can find it in a lot of seeds. You can actually extract it from seeds. Completely natural. It totally kills you in seconds. So it doesn't mean that when you're using like a plant-based therapy that is better than a chemical that you extracted from other plants, right? That concept is really, really not true. Now, can you have plant-based therapies, alternative therapies that are safe? Yes, there's a number of them, okay? I'm not against it at all. It's just that I want to take away the idea, the concept that when you want to go natural and medication free, you're actually going a better, safer route. And that's actually sometimes the opposite, right? You may go into something that's actually far worse than you had planned before. I'll give you another example. So one of the most common breast cancer medications today is paclitaxel. It's used in almost all cases now of advanced stage breast cancer, right? It's extracted from a tree from North America, right? And probably you guys didn't know that, right? But the name of the tree, I just wrote, the name of the tree is called Taxus brevifolia. It's in the west coast of the North America, right? And extracted from a plant, right? Aspirin. Have you guys ever heard of aspirin? So aspirin, same idea, is extracted from a bark of a willow tree that we actually have here in North America too. Right? These are all natural. Okay? So drugs, it's independent whether they're coming from a laboratory or they're coming from a tea, they're the same. They have side effects, they have risks, and they have benefits. And we have to take them all into context, right? When we're talking about it, right? Now, so the lecture now, we're going to shift slightly to concept of illicit drugs, okay, or drugs that can harm you, even being illicit, okay, because I think we kind of did a good overall understanding of how we can classify drugs and depending on use and how we use them, right? So we're surrounded by drugs every single day and time in our lives. Every time we go and we eat something, we bite something, and we're exposed to something, when we go outside, when we get in contact with nature sometimes, some animals and frogs and things, they all can have significant poisons, for example, that can affect us, right? So we know that. Now, why? So when we move now to drugs that can actually harm you significantly, right? Let's say illicit drugs. This is a major health problem, and I think the concept is, the idea from most of us in research in this area is that things are not going to get better now. So they're going to get far worse till they get better, right? Because of a triad of supporting evidence that comes from the National Institute of Drug Abuse from the United States. The main research right now, the main body of research shows to us that we use drugs. Now, this is like psychotropic drugs that can affect your brain, and people use it as illicit drugs, right? To feel better, to do better, for curiosity, and for peer pressure. So there's like 4 different main categories of reasoning why people go into it, okay? And the first 2 are quite concerning, because if you're doing something because you want to do better and feel better, that's what everyone does at once, right? That is like the core of what we try to do every day. And if that's also the reason why people take this alternate routes to get there, if you use a medication that will alter your brain function so you feel better for 10 seconds, right? And you want to go that route, that's quite scary. Because then what happens is you certainly, the audience of potential users of medication or drugs that can do that is quite broad. It's like a lot of people, right? Now, the only thing you're missing on that mixture is availability, right? So if the drug is available and you need to feel better and you feel that that particular drug will make you feel better, then you have the perfect storm, right? So you will get it. And costs too, right? So costs and availability, we already have it. Drugs are everywhere, illicit drugs. And the prices are going down significantly, right? Because of increased production. So that's why, in general, we're very concerned, because now the driver of it is there. So people want to exit reality because reality is tough, right? They want to do better, feel better, do something different. They want to feel, they're pressured by peers, right? And now they have access to it, and the costs are going down. So that is the perfect storm, right? And that's exactly what we're living right now in time. And that is why, even if you look at the Canadian Centre for Addictions, for example, which has a very nice website about it, they describe also in a very methodical and clear way for all populations, like for anyone, doesn't need to be have any scientific background. They describe, how can you get from using a medication that's perfectly fine and safe when prescribed accordingly to someone who starts to self-medicate, and then next time you start to abuse that same medication, and then you go into that cycle that pretty much has no end, right? So you're always dependent. You're addicted to a particular substance. Family history is important too. Families that do have a context, a previous history of drug addictions and drug abuse will have much higher chance of having drug abuse later on. For example, influences by where you are, where you live, and that's unfortunate too, because there's a very interesting research from Hamilton that they did an analysis of populations that lived in the poorest part of the city in downtown versus the population that lived in the more up and coming areas in the valley or in the mountain, and then what they realized is that depending on where you're born, your chances of not being successful and being addicted and having major health issues is skyrockets. So it does depend on a lot of things. Where you're born, for example, if you're in a family that's situated in that particular, they call it red area, your chances of you being addicted are, I don't know, remember now, but many folds higher than any other one in the same area, right? So there's so many variables that they are playing in this, right? Emotional instability, stress in family, stress in work, right? So those are all the things that combined can create the perfect scenario for drug addictions. And what we're talking about, so what is a drug addiction? So addiction is defined, or abuse or addiction is defined in a moment where that medication or drug or whatever you're taking will affect your life in a negative way, right? So that's the first criteria. So, drinking coffee is certainly not going to reach that criteria, right? Maybe we feel a little bit happier, when we drink it, but that's certainly not affecting you negatively, unless maybe you're drinking 50 coffees a day, and that you may have a problem. But other drugs can do that in the very first use, right? For example, crack cocaine, right? The research shows now that the very first use of crack cocaine puts you in a 60% risk of addiction. One use, okay? So those are the very serious concerns we have, right? So first of all, it affects your life in a negative way. So it affects your family, your relationship, your work, anything, right? Second of all, you need increasing amounts of that same medication or drug to continue your effects, right? So that's the second criteria. And the third criteria is that you cannot live or think without involving that particular medication or drug in your life anymore. In other words, for alcohol, that's a big one, right? So if every time you're going to a party, you're concerned whether or not you're going to have alcohol available, think about it, right? That is affecting your behavior, that's affecting your thoughts, and you're like preoccupied. You're like thinking ahead of time whether or not you have available, because you have a pattern in your brain now. You go to certain gatherings, you need the alcohol, right? That kind of goes hand in hand, right? Until a point that if you don't have it, you don't go to the party anymore. Have you heard of I'm not going to that party, it's not going to be a nice party, there's no alcohol, right? A lot of people say that, right? And that is a turning point for a lot of us, right? So we don't count how many drinks you have in a week anymore, because that is hugely variable, right? Someone can have 1 drink a day and be addicted, okay? And someone can have 40 drinks a day and be addicted, so there's a huge variability on that. So we count mostly by behaviors, right? In general, okay? Now let's talk about how those drugs or medications in general, everything that we're talking about in general is a big umbrella of drugs, right? Being illicit or illicit or prescribed or non-prescribed, put all of them in the same category, okay? So how do they affect our body? Right, so each one of those drugs have a different method of action, right? So the mechanism of action is very different from each one of them. Some of them will make us stimulate, right? So we'll wake up and we'll do things much more energetically, and we don't sleep. Or others will do exactly the opposite. A lot of people take medication for sleeping, right? So the idea is that they'll put your brain to slow down a little bit so you can get into a mode that you can sleep, right? And a lot of people benefit from that, right? So Caffeine is one of the stimulant drugs, like cocaine, caffeine, nicotine. Those are all stimulant drugs. They're all in the same category, right? Now, the next question then is, how do they affect us as a spirit? Okay, and that's the big point of today. All right, so let's think about this. When you take a particular, let's say a drug that's commonly available and a lot of us do take, alcohol, right? So when you're drinking alcohol, and what do you think is one of the very first effects of alcohol in general? What do you guys think? In your body, what happens?
Relax.
Yeah, maybe relax a little bit, right? So it depresses a little bit. It depresses also a center of the self-regulation and emotions. So it makes you talk more, makes you be more sociable, right? But also makes some of your thoughts go wary, right? Because it's interesting because the drug itself will make you will shut down some of this mechanism in your brain. So it actually relaxes you, but at the same time impedes mechanisms that control your behavior. So that's why your behavior go really wary when you talk too more, you talk too loud. We know we all. Well, we don't. I don't need to lecture about that, right? So we got it. What happens in that particular way? So see, now I'm going to focus on the thoughts, right? Because that's the main connection that we're going to talk about today. So do you think your thoughts are going to be different when you're under the effects of alcohol versus the one when you're not? So what are you thinking? So not what you're saying sometimes, because even if you drink a little, let's say you drink a little shot and you're not really, doing anything different, but your thoughts are changed for sure, right? Because that's one of the, so you take off the brakes from what you think. And then eventually you take off the brakes of everything and you do all sorts of things, right? But the very first step is that. Now, spiritually, how do we connect to the spiritual world? Is it by what we say or by what we think? Bingo, by what we think, right? Such in a way that thoughts are considered, and we talked about it in the last lecture, thoughts is they're a combination of matter and immaterial things and emanations from this vibration that we don't have a particular element or trace element. We can't really describe what it is, but it surrounds us. So when you're thinking, even if you're sitting in a work meeting that someone is using like a 1,500 slide presentation about a topic that you know already, right? And you're sitting there quietly, it's like, okay, it doesn't matter what you look like to people, your thoughts are racing, right? Always. You're always going to be like, what am I doing here? I don't want to look at this. Maybe people are in the Spiritist Center doing the same thing, but that's another lecture. But, if we're there and our thoughts are racing, so basically, spiritually, if I'm looking at you, I'm going to see what you're thinking, right? Not who you are, really. You surround yourself with those emanating thoughts, right? So any medication that will affect the way your thoughts are processed will definitely change the way you're seen spiritually. So everyone can see you in your deep thoughts. Everything that the inner thoughts that sometimes alcohol let it loose, right? That's going to be seen right away, okay? But not only that. So when we're drinking alcohol and we're processing our body, we emanate it. So spirits that have an addiction on alcohol will really try to get close to you. Not only because of that, because they're connecting by the thoughts. So if you're feeling good with the feeling of having a drink, anyone who feels good about having a drink will be close to you. Either it's discarnated or it's alive or incarnated, right? Everyone will get together, right? Do you like to invite the guy that never drinks to have a drink with you? Is that a fun sometimes, maybe? Maybe if you drink just a little bit, social. But if you want to, I'm going to go out today, I'm going to, close the bar today, okay? Do you invite the guy that never drinks to be your best buddy on that day? Rarely, right? That's exactly why, because the symphony of the thoughts are not coinciding perfectly, because we attract each other based on that. So spiritually, it doesn't change. So if you're sitting in a bar and having 50 beers, who's going to be sitting beside you spiritually? Someone who needs to drink 50 beers too, for sure. Now, let's put it this now. So now I have best buddies from the spiritual world that do exactly what I do, right? So they're, you know, if you do good things, then you have a lot of people that do good things. You see how the law is perfect? It's all on you, right? You decide what to do, okay? But let's say you're doing something that's, you know, on the illicit side, even like taking away from alcohol, let's say something illicit. So if you're there, the pleasure, the energy, the feelings that you have at that moment are being propagated around you. So you're really like a magnet to everyone who shares that same feeling. Now imagine a spirit that discarnated because of addiction. They cannot have the drug anymore, right? Do you think they're going to be in a state of shock because they're addicted and they can't have the drug? What happens? Do you think they're going to feel good? Or they're going to be in a complete desperation mode to try to get that drug again? Nothing changes. When we discarnate, we're not like these angelic beings that go away and fly around and go to this angelic camps of trees. We are the same, exactly the same, without a body. A little bit worse now because we don't have the regulatory control anymore of their thoughts. So now we're literally, everything we think, that's who we are. When we're incarnated, we have this little containment system, right? That we can control our thoughts and maybe disguise our thoughts, right? So we can actually pretend that we're something and we're not, right? In the spiritual world, we can't, because that everyone will see us. Like, oh, that guy's thinking that. Haha, I know what you're doing, right? So in spiritual world, same thing. So now this is the combination. You have someone using a particular drug and a spirit that is desperately needing to use that drug, and they cannot, because, you know, obviously they cannot, their spirit now, right? They can't put that into their bodies, right? So what do? They tag along each other, right? Because the spirit now that it's desperately designed to use that drug will feed off the energies and thoughts of the individual who's actually incarnated using the drug. So we set up a plot for one of the worst cases of obsessions that exist, right? Because it's such a vicious cycle that it never ends. Now, why is it difficult now for the incarnated gentleman or lady that is using that particular drug to get out of it? Have you thought about it? Now let's talk about the spiritual. We know the physical aspects of it, right? So our brain connectors, our neurotransmitters are changed. It's hard to do it, blah, blah, blah. We know all that. Now, in the spiritual world, now what happens? Now, that individual is surrounded by sometimes hundreds of spirits that are sharing the same addiction. When they try to change their thoughts now and say, wait a minute, I'm not gonna use this drug anymore. I'm gonna change my thoughts. Boom. What happens? There's like this revolt that happens around them. Because none of those spirits want them to stop. Because that individual is the source of their addiction now. It's not easy. They'll try everything they can to influence the incarnated individual to go back to use the drug. Because that's how they're living now. Their addiction is fueled by the incarnated. They are still on the same addiction, right? Is that different when you're incarnated or discarnated? It's not. The peer pressure works exactly the same way. So if you're in a group of 5 individuals who are sharing the same addiction, you know, whatever that addiction is or whatever drug it is, do you think it's easy for one of them to bail out and say, I'm out of this? It's very hard. Because every time they meet again, they'll do it again. How hard? It's very hard. Does it change from spirit? It does not change anything from the spiritual world. Any connections between. Okay? So, in Domains of Mediumship by André Luiz, in chapter 15, Aulus, which is the mentor of the trip of that day, André Luiz and Hilario are they're the learners, right? So they're in the mission on Earth, right? So they're homing the streets, and they see a gentleman which is heavily intoxicated by alcohol walking out of a bar, right? And André Luiz and Hilario, both of them look at that scenario and they're quite puzzled. And they're quite puzzled not only because they can see that the individual is intoxicated, but they can see what the individual is thinking and what is surrounding him, right? So as you guys can possibly imagine, there's a significant obsession happening to a point that when the incarnated individual is actually taking the drink, the spirit is actually completely connected to a point that's just like he's holding the glass at the same time. So they're like tightly connected. Such a point that the spirit at that point, who also is addicted or need alcohol, they're almost like in what they call a symbiosis. That's how I'll always describe it. So symbiosis is a mechanism where two organisms really leave off each other, depend on each other, such a point they're connected to each other, right? And that's how Aulus described the mechanism, like almost like a symbiosis. By the time someone is in that scenario, like getting intoxicated by alcohol. Okay. Now, we don't need to alarm ourselves. Okay, so we're not talking about you opening a beer at home when you're getting tired and have a beer and go to sleep. That's not what we're talking about. Okay, so we're talking about scenarios where you're in a place where the environment spiritually is not good, and we know all those places. I don't need to remind you guys, right? Or your level of addiction to that particular drug is actually changing your behavior. Remember we talked about addictions, right? Remember, it could be 1 drink a day or 1 drink every 2 days. Doesn't matter. We don't count drinks. But if that is changing the way you are and the way you think, certainly someone is in the spiritual world hovering around you and say, hey, let's keep going, okay? So that's the scenario we're talking about, okay? Obviously, for illicit drugs, it's a little bit more difficult because then we know that with a single use, you can already expose yourself to an addiction. Certainly, with a single use, you can already expose yourself to an obsession, right? Or this negative, deleterious spiritual influence that is relentless, right, and affects your behavior too. Okay. Aulus also brings a very interesting topic. So when they go into the bar now with André Luiz and Hilario, right, they're looking at the spiritual world. Like, so they have their spirits that are discarnated. They walk into a bar and they can see both the incarnated beings and the discarnated beings at the same time, and they can see the relationship between them, right? So they walk in, and they also realize that there's a two-way communication system happening in some scenarios. In other words, not only this spirit is influencing the individual, but the individual is also sharing the same energy of the discarnated spirits. In other words, one is like feeding the thoughts of each other. So they kind of, this symbiosis, this process occurs in that way. So both of them are so connected into that moment. Okay, very hard to disconnect that. Right, to change that behavior. Okay, now and then this is now interesting because now Hilario, which is a very interesting character in the book and all the books of André Luiz, because he asks a lot of questions, and that's good for us because how we learn in the book, right? And I really like him. So he's going to start asking lots and lots of questions to all of us. Like, and one of the questions, he's going to say this. So looking at this scenario, Hilario was really, really puzzled because, like, how can we stop this, right? And I think it's a fair question because I had the same question. Because in his mind, it's like, this is like never ending, right? They're happy with each other, right? One is feeding off each other thoughts. One likes to drink, the other one likes to drink too. They drink together and they have fun with it, right? So, sorry. So what's going to happen? And then Aulus says, obviously it's challenging, okay, but obviously not impossible, right? Because thank you very much. Just a little bit of water. Too much caffeine this morning. Mouth is dry. That's one of the effects of caffeine, by the way. It's true. So what we're going to do, right? How are we going to stop this? Right? So obviously we need a commitment from the incarnated spirit to change, right? We need that. We need to drive that, right? And we're going to talk about it in a minute. But he also, Hilario was concerned because it's like, oh, okay, so we were really talking that, I was really concerned that this is like a trap. Like we're just like this two individuals, the spirit and the incarnated, will just live like that for forever, right? And then all of a sudden, this has never happened. It doesn't matter how long it takes, it will eventually end. Okay, and both of them will come and they'll repair, or they will go through some scenarios where they have to almost like a payback system, right? They have to overcome the challenges that they've created with their addictions, right? And then Larry's asking again, so how is that possible? And then Always explain, you know, many of these individuals will eventually even like pass and will discarnate because of their addictions or the alcohol, drug use, whatever that type of drug is, right? And then when they come back, obviously they'll think about it in the spiritual world. They'll understand what happened, right? They'll go through a lot of help and teachings and lectures, just like we're doing here. So nothing really changed much, right? And then they'll have a chance to come again. And many times they'll come again with some particular challenges in their physical body, right? And the reason why, and I'll explain you why. For example, someone who has used a particular psychotropic drug, so a drug that targets your brain specifically, right? So when you use it for a long period of time, not only you change the physical brain, right, the brain itself, the neurons, but you also imprint that damage into your perispiritual body. Right? So your perispiritual body, when you discarnate, will continue, right? So we continue with the perispiritual body, and that's what we'll see in the spirit discarnated, right? That perispiritual body will contain all the damage that was created when you're using the drug. So when you come back to your new body, that image that you created in the perispiritual body will cause an effect on your new brain when it develops, right? And Always explains to us that some of those cases, the patients will come with severe developmental challenges. They may come with epilepsy. They may come with undiagnosed diseases. They may come with challenges with speech development. They can come with phobias and ADHD type symptoms. You know, they can come with all of those symptoms. And why? Because that is now the time that they're really re-equilibrating their perispiritual body, their physical body, because of the damage that was done when the addiction was present. Same thing with someone with an alcoholism problem. They'll have problems in the liver, primarily, right? So they can have problems anywhere, but the liver is the most common one. So what happens then, when I discarnate, right, the damage that I cause to my system will continue in my perispiritual body. And I have to go through my expiations, and I have to go to my trials to revert that back to normal. Because that's how we learn. That's the law. Remember the law? Law is perfect. In the spiritual world, the law is always perfect. If I do better and I change myself like this, can I shorten my trials? Oh, for sure. God is always trying to help us. Divine Providence is always looking forward for us to change and say, well, you know, we're going to help you. So it doesn't mean that if I do something now, I'll come back next time with this particular disease. That does not happen in the spiritual world. Okay? What happens is depending on who we are and how we change. So we have examples where people change during the incarnation itself, and then they come back next time, fine, because I already paid back what I've done, right? It's very challenging, yes, it's very challenging, but it's not impossible, okay? So if I had an addiction problem and I was able to get out of it and I started to make changes so other people don't go through the same path that I go, that's a very good example how I can change and I help others. And by helping others, I get rid of my own disease in the spiritual body, right? So when I come back, everything's fine and happy again, okay? So it doesn't mean that I really need to go through a trial, but most of the times, yes, we eventually have to, okay? So the summary is, everything you do that affects your physical body in a negative way will have consequences in the long term. When I mean long term, it's not long term when you're alive. It means incarnated. It means long term for eternity, right? And it's up to me to compensate for that. So the call is, let's do it now. Now in Spiritism, a lot of Spiritists will tell me, it says like, you know, this I cannot do in this incarnation. I'll do it next time I come in. That is the worst thing you can possibly say, because you're already setting yourself up for trouble, right? And we have a say right now. We say, why we don't do things now? Why we let it for another day, right? That's the same thing in the spiritual world. If I can't change myself now, why I'm gonna wait to discarnate, right? And then have another chance to come back so I can start and try to change next time? It's not gonna happen. right? It's just delaying things that are so obvious that you need to address. So the call for us, even now, Aulus finishing his message, he said, this is a time for us to think about who we are and what we do, and a time to implement the changes that will lead us to a positive future, right? To a positive change, right? And that is the call for us. We need to act on it, right? And if you see someone going through these issues, I know it's very challenging. It's not that we're going to come to someone who has an addiction problem or drug abuse or any type of those and say, "Lay body, this is the issue. Like, you're going to go into the discriminated world, and you're going to have this, and you're going to." That's not going to change in any way that individual. We know that, right? So we need a support system, right? And we have that through medicine, our medical world. And we also have it through our spiritual world by, obviously, the prayers, the teachings, the understanding. Everything combined will eventually make a positive change. Don't be frustrated if it doesn't happen like now, but we'll do. Like, every little seed that you plant has a positive consequence, right? Even if one little message you pass through the mind of that individual that's going through that suffering, a little one, and they attach to it, right, will save him some difficulties and challenges in the future, right? So that's something very important. Allan Kardec also brings in the Spirit's book something that's quite interesting, which applies to all of us here, right? And it's the concept of an indirect suicide, right? So we understand suicide is, people take their own lives, right? That's the definition of it, okay? But anything in the spiritual sense, anything you do that you shorten your experience in this particular incarnation is considered almost like a type of suicide, right? So if you have access, it doesn't mean to be drugs, but any type of accesses and risky situations that you put yourself in, and drugs and things that you can use or you do that will shorten what it was expected for you to stay in this particular incarnation, well, you have to address that because that was your responsibility, right? So people say that, this is my own body, I do whatever I can, right? Have you heard this? I have whatever I want, right? We hear this every single day, and it's partially true, yes. So we have an ability of think and rationalize what we want to do with our own bodies, right? We do. We cannot deny that. That's called free will, and that is the number one tool that God gives to us, so we can learn things and move forward, right? We can use it to make some decisions that goes against us, and we can make the free will to good decisions that go to in favor of us, right? So in truth, yes, people can do anything they want with their bodies, right? So that's the free will. Even if the law says no, in the end, the decision is always on the individual. But what we're just missing on that entire thought is the consequences, right? So anything you do that affects your body in a negative way will have a negative consequence, and you have to deal with it. So I think if all of us could understand those concepts from a spiritual perspective, it will save a lot of sorrow and a lot of pain for all of us, right? Because the math is simple, right? You do something good, you get a little bonus point. You got something negative, you get a negative point. But you can't be zero. So if you do something negative, you kind of have two good things to go in the positive side again, right? You really have to work hard, right? And that is very important in a spiritual perspective, because I think Spiritism in the end, what Allan Kardec brings and what André Luiz brings and everyone's bringing, is a very simple message to be incorporated in practice. Even if you don't believe anything about, the spiritual body and how things happen and blah, 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 how one affects each other, you don't need to believe any of that. That's fine. But the principle is very, very straightforward. And the principle is this. For every action, there's a reaction that's proportional to the initial offense, right? Or to the initial action, right? So anything you do against your body, or anything you do that will shorten your life, anything you do that affects another person negatively will have a proportional consequence, a reaction. That is a law of physics that applies to Spiritism, applies to anything, right? And if we can make anything we can right now, today, not tomorrow, oh, I'm going to start dieting tomorrow kind of thing, right? So tomorrow, It's like Monday, right? So I'm going to start on Monday. That does not work. We know that, right? In the spiritual world, it's the same thing. That does not work. So let us change now, right? So we can start to make the changes that will lessen our challenges in the future, right? Because even if our law, I'll give you an example. So our law says, you know, unless you're drinking in a public park, and then yes, you're going to be fined and stuff, right? But if you're drinking and you drink a lot and you have a liver damage and you die out of it, right? Our law will say fine, no problem, right? There's no law that prohibits you from drinking to the point that you have liver damage, right?
You can give a transplant.
Right? Yeah, you can even do a transplant, right? But in the spiritual world, yes, there is. And someone will talk to you like, listen, buddy, we prepared yourself for 20, 30, 50 years to go into this incarnation. And you remember we talked about this? You're gonna to go to school, and you're supposed to start a charity, and you're supposed to help people, or you're gonna be a president that's supposed to help others, and you went there and decided to do everything against what you proposed to do, right? Have you guys heard of that? Right. So, you know, if you think about that, and then when you go back there, so nothing illegal so far, right? So when you go to the other side, and you're going to be called on that. It's like a little contract that you signed. So taking care of your body, so law of preservation is there, right? So that's very, very important, and we have to think about it all every day, everything we do. We will be called upon what we signed up for, right? So someone signs a contract. Someone just posted a picture of a contract here, so I just remember that. When someone signs a contract with a company, okay? So you're going to sign a contract, right? So the clauses you have to follow, right? That's our law. We all agree, right? That's what happens. So we follow those laws. If I don't follow those laws, those clauses, what happens? It's called early termination. Right? I'm out. Isn't that true? Do we complain about it? We can, right? We can put a grievance, we can do all sorts of things, but in the end, we'll lose the job. Okay? When we come back here, in this body that we're seeing right now, we have a little contract. But the contract, the company, is a difficult one for you to challenge. Right? Because it's a company that is characterized by the law of perfection, justice, and good. So it is a perfection. So you can't challenge it. So you have to look at yourself and say, what did I do? I can't go to court and say, oh, but I didn't get a chance of, no one told me, my spiritual mentor was never with me. It's like, yeah, sure, you know. He was there all the time, like tapping you. It's like, get out of here, you know, I don't want to talk to you, right? He was there all the time. Oh, but no one told me this. Yes, your conscience told you. You said no to it. Oh, but, you know, I didn't know I have to do this. It's like, yes, that's what we're doing here. Right now, you know, sorry, guys. Okay? Now, you can't say, like, oh, I didn't know, right? So religion told you, science told you, your conscience told you, everyone's trying to help, right? You can't go back there and say, oh, I'm sorry, you know, I didn't know. Yeah. So you have to deal with the consequences exactly how you created them, right? So that is what Spiritism brings to us. Okay? Now let's talk about, in the last 5 minutes, let's talk about something we can do now, more practical ways, right? So we talked about the action and reaction. We talk about law of preservation. We talk about the consequences when we, when we use certain drugs, or we abuse them, or we use in the ways that were not prescribed. We talk about all that. So let's talk about what we can do now. Okay. So addictions, they're managed in both ways, in a medical way and also in a spiritual way. Okay. So don't think that, because I'm giving one particular medication now for this individual that will cut the effects of that drug, that is the solution. We have an example. For example, we have an opioid crisis today in this country and in the world, right? And I think all of us are aware of that, okay? So what do we do to stop, those opioid overdoses, right? We inject a particular medication, like, we can give methadone for a long period of time. So that will will take off the edge of that necessity of, continuing to use the medication, well, the drug. Okay, that is not a solution. We know that. That's a temporary fix, right? So the treatment is very challenging because we need psychological support, we need social support, and we need spiritual support. And the spiritual support is the one that we normally don't look at. Okay? And unfortunately, social support is hard to find sometimes. And medical support, people are flagged and targeted in our system, and sometimes they don't get the chances that they should because they're addicted. Right? So, see, in every one of those steps, we have challenges. Right? Unfortunately, our system is not very well designed to deal with the emergency that we're dealing with today. We don't have enough beds. We don't have enough people. We don't have a significant way of dealing with this, okay? But spiritually, we can help a little bit. Even if it's as simple as praying for someone and not judging them in a negative way all the time. Like when you see someone who is addicted in opioid and say, "What are you doing here? You're just using drugs every day." Yes, they are. They are addicted. They cannot do anything different. Their brains changed. Their spirit has changed. He's been obsessed. Like it's a chaos, right? And if you walk past them and say, what are you doing? You're sending a little bit of alcohol inside those big flames. That's what you're doing. I'm sorry, right? We have to be compassionate. We have to understand, right? So walk by them, pray for them. That's the little you can possibly do to help. Right? Just by not kicking them out of the sidewalk because you don't like to see them, control yourself because you know more. Like you're in a situation that you can help, even if it's just by praying for those individuals or your family members or someone in the street or someone in the news. How many times I heard this? Oh, someone died of overdose. Now they say ODs, right? It's like a popular thing. It's like, oh, someone OD'd in the bathroom. And like it took me a while to understand what that means, but now I understand. So someone had an overdose in a bathroom. I heard people, and sometimes in the subway, and like look at the news with me. It's like, oh, he deserved it, right? Okay. So, am I in a position to judge that? How many times I killed myself before as a spirit? Probably hundreds. Now I've learned finally that I cannot do that anymore. Right? Everyone's going a different route. So just close your eyes for half a second and say, God bless these people, make them be aware and understand and maybe change their minds in the spiritual world if that's where they are. Okay? So that's what you can do in the spiritual side. Okay? Now, peer support, recovery programs, there's all sorts of information out there. Now, talk to people about it. Don't create this as a little dogma that you can't really talk about drugs. I talk about drugs to some of my friends. In a way that this is what the evidence, should not. Let's avoid this. And let's not think about. Let's try to help. Let's talk to people, right? We should talk to people, right? This is the problem. We can't just say, oh, someone is drinking too much. One of my friends, but I'm not gonna say anything because it's fine. Talk, right? You can lose your friend. Yeah, you possibly can, but at the same time, you may have started the change. And that's going to save someone's life. Okay? So spiritually, right? So if someone is in need, is an obsession, or in need of spiritual treatment, we can provide here, for example, in the Toronto Spirit Society, fraternal assistance, we can do prayers, we can do something, right? So if you know someone, why not? Right? We can help. Right? Not only here, like there's peer support groups in every religion almost. Right? They can help too. Reconnect to God. Right? So that is a very, very important message. Okay? And obviously, if one of us is going through this, we have to position ourselves in a way that we're open to receive help. Because that's a big challenge too. Right? The very beginning of the process starts with the denial, and the denial will prevent you from being helped, and if you're not helped, things will just get worse. Okay? So if someone tells you, like, you got to watch out for this, just think about it, right? Maybe they're right. And maybe that's the time for us to make some changes in our lives too. Okay. Okay, so this is what I wanted to talk to you about, guys, about. So, and as you know, as a big take-home message from this is like, you know, remember this. There's a lot of misconceptions about drugs. Many of our drugs are very, very helpful if they're prescribed and used appropriately. This whole theories that are out there today that people should not get vaccinated, or if you take this medication, that's what I'm gonna have. There's no evidence of any of that. Like, this is just complete, pure group paranoia that was created about lack of evidence, and we have a problem with that today. Okay, you know, obviously, a lot of drugs and toxins and very lethal things can be found all around us every day, even when we're not thinking about it, right? So again, that misconception of, you know, I'm doing this as natural, I'm not going to do that, I'm not going to take medication. So just try to get the right information, okay? Access the right information, read about it, okay? So the effects of drugs in our own bodies and how does that affect us as a spirit, that's very important, right? So just think about this. Every time we take something into our system that can change us as a body, will certainly change our spiritual environment, and obviously can lead to some negative changes in the spiritual world too, right? So they're all tied together, okay? All right, so thank you very much. Got some questions now? Yes.
Thank you, Marco. Yeah,
Stay here.
Okay.
Stay here. Stay put.
That was very good.
Yes, thank you.
Very informative. I think it's a subject that I think interests everybody, especially nowadays. As I said, we are in crisis right now.
Correct. Yes.
And it's important to know what's happening here, but also spiritually what's happening when the drug abuse happens. Any questions, any comments, anything from the internet? Okay.
Not there? Okay.
No questions, no comments? Okay. So let's get ready then for our pass. Thank you,
Thank
Marco.
you.
Thank you, everyone that was with us over the internet. Hope to see you next Sunday again.